Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut, continuing our series on the spiritual nature of water. Tonight, we are going to really delve into something that we've mentioned, but we haven't really tackled it, and that is the nature of water as regards to ritual purity and impurity, and of course, the mikvah. We've mentioned the mikvah, but tonight we are going to really try to explore deeper the nature of water as it relates to ritual purity. So, first of all, the Mishnah is divided into 6 orders, and the last order is called Tahorot. It's all about ritual purity, meaning a whole 6th of the entire Mishnah is dedicated to understanding the very, very intricate, complex laws of ritual purity and impurity. And this is not really the platform to go into great depths about it, but most of these laws do not apply today because most of them were in conjunction with visiting the temple. And if someone was in a state of ritual impurity, they could not come to the temple. And so we don't have a temple now. And so many of these laws don't relate directly to our actually fulfilling them, though understanding the reasons behind them and the underpinnings, the spiritual ideas still relate. All the mitzvot still relate to today. The one major area of these laws of impurity is the laws of nida, of a menstruating woman, especially if she is married, and the whole laws of what are called the laws of family purity, taharata mishpacha. So here, we're just going to start with just an overview of these different ideas. So first of all, there are degrees to ritual purity. There are many different levels, and the most serious one, or the most stringent one, is what's called tumat met. That if someone is in contact with a dead human body, then this is the strictest level of impurity. And then there are many, many, many other degrees, 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree of impurity. So in other words, if someone touches a dead corpse, that's one level. If someone touches a person who touched a dead corpse, that's another level. If someone touched a chair that a person who touched death came in contact with, so that's another level. So all of these are connected to what's called tumat met. Then there are the laws of menstruation that we'll touch on just briefly. And then there is when a woman gives birth, she becomes impure, and there's a whole set of laws in Parshat Tazria, in the book of Leviticus, about that kind of impurity. And then there's a type of impurity that relates to different discharges from the body. This applies to men and women. And this is, again, another level of impurity. And then we have the one disease that is mentioned in the Torah is called sura'at. commonly translated as leprosy, even though we're told it's not technically leprosy. But almost 2 whole parshas deal with this disease, and then the purification process that happens afterwards. So here I just very, very briefly went through many different types of impurity. Some of them have up to a 7-day purification process, but most of them, well, that relates to Tumat Met and also Nida after menstruation. But for most of the other types of impurity, like let's say touching a dead insect, which is not the same as touching a human body. And in the Torah, it says over and over again that a person will wash their body, and the words are rachatz, wash their body, and wait until evening, and then they become pure. But the Torah never really explains, well, how does this washing happen? Is this in a bathtub? Is this in a shower? Can you just do it with a washcloth? It doesn't actually explain. Now, this is where, of course, we need the oral Torah. The oral Torah explains that every time it says that you have to wash your body, it's talking about immersing in a mikvah. What's interesting is, well, how do they know it means to immerse in a mikvah? Washing, like I said, can have many different connotations. So how do they know it means to immerse in a mikvah? And it's interesting because it was either last week or the week before when we were doing a survey of different stories in the Tanakh that had to do with water. We talked about one of the stories with the prophet Elisha, and the general from a neighboring country had this had a skin disease, and he was told, go to this prophet and he'll be able to heal you, because nothing else had worked. So he comes to the prophet Elisha, and Elisha tells him to go immerse in the Jordan River 7 times. And at first, he was very skeptical because he came from Damascus. And Damascus has 2 major rivers running through it or near it. And he was like, well, I could have stayed home and dunked myself in a river. Why are you telling me I come all this way and you tell me to dunk myself 7 times and that's it? But nonetheless, he did do it. And there, it says taval. Elisha told him to wash. And it says that he immersed. In other words, he understood it meant to immerse. So this is one of the textual supports for this idea that every place in the Torah where it says you have to wash your skin, it means to immerse in a mikvah. Now, interestingly enough, in the written Torah, there is only one verse that talks about the mikvah. One verse, it's in Leviticus, Vayikra, the 11th chapter, the 36th verse, 11:36. So I'm just going to read it to you in Hebrew and English. It says, Ach mayan ubor mikvah mayim yiyeh tahor. Only a spring and a pit, a gathering of water, shall be clean. That's everything that the written Torah says about a mikvah. Everything else we know from the oral Torah. So here I'm just going to mention a few of the, we'll call it foundational laws of a mikvah that is learned from this verse. Now it mentions only a spring and a pit, a gathering of water shall be clean. So the question is, what is the spring here? And how does that relate to mikvah? And what is the pit? So one could think that these two things go together. In other words, a mikvah has to be spring water that is in a pit in the ground. But this is not correct. And we know from the oral Torah that we're really talking about two different things here. A spring, which sometimes then becomes a stream or a river and flows into a lake, it's all based on what's called spring water. So spring water, to be a kosher mikvah, is allowed to be moving. It can move because a spring is considered the highest level of pure water, called mayim chaim, living waters. And so therefore, it can be flowing. But the verse says a spring and a pit. But it's because it's talking about two different things. The pit is the gathering of water. If one does not have access to a spring or a body of water that's the majority coming from a spring, then the mikvah that most people recognize is it has to be in the earth. It has to be dug into the earth. That's why it's called a pit. And nowadays, of course, we go to a building that houses a mikvah that is dug into the ground. In our days, we don't actually see a pit. We see a nicely, tiled mikvah. But if it's not a flowing spring, it has to be a gathering of water. And the gathering of water has to be a minimum of what's called 40 seah, 40 seah. What is a seah? Approximately 5 gallons in USA terms, not metric. 5 gallons, meaning it has to be approximately 200 gallons of water. That sounds like a lot, but it's the minimum. The minimum. You can go into the lake or the ocean and obviously have a lot more than 200 gallons. But the minimum has to be the amount that would cover completely a human body, an average human body. Because the whole idea of immersing is the whole body has to be under the water for it to be considered a kosher immersion. The whole body has to be under the water. So this is in the gathering of water. And when it's not a spring, it can't be moving. That's why it has to be in a gathered place. We're going to see later the verses that we learn this from. So many people will ask, well, when I go to the mikvah, how do they keep it clean? In other words, if you have a mikvah and it has, usually mikvahs are not that big. Usually you can only fit 2, 3, 4 people in at a time, some even less. So how do they keep it clean? So what many people don't know is that the mikvah that we go into is not actually the pit with the water of the mikvah. So how does it work? There are really two, we're going to call them two mikvahs, two gatherings of water. One is the water that comes from living waters. It's going to come either from a spring or from rainwater or from snow or some derivative of that gets to the mikvah through any means that would not become impure. In other words, you can't channel the water of a mikvah through any kind of material that itself could become impure. So this water goes into what's called the bore, and that's actually the wording of the pasuk. Ach mayan ubor mikvah mayim. Now here, again, mikvah means a gathering of water. So you have a bore, you have your gathering of the water, and then what happens is they put a hole. It's called a sheferet between the two gatherings of water. And the law is that as long as you have the 40 measures of kosher water for the mikvah, it can touch, and actually the wording is kiss, through this hole. It can touch 1,000,000 gallons of water, and it turns the 1,000,000 gallons of water into a kosher mikvah. That is how it works. So again, if you go to a mikvah, sometimes we may not even have noticed it. You're going to see a small opening. Sometimes there's a plug there, because once the two have touched or kissed, that water is now considered part of the mikvah. So now when they want to clean the mikvah, they just put the plug in and they empty the water of the part of the mikvah that we go to. They fill it, they clean it, they fill it up. Today, almost all mikvahs have filters now that keep them very, very clean. But that's basically how the mikvah is working. And the kissing is called hashaka, from the same root as kissing. And the two waters touch each other. So going back to one of our first classes, when we talked about the letter mem, and we said that the numerical value of mem is 40, and the first letter of mikvah is a mem. So we made a very strong connection between the letter mem, which is the letter of mayim. Mayim is spelled mem, yud, mem. So that's the significance of the 40 sa'ah, because it's connected to the mem. And we talked a lot about the letter, the number 40 throughout Jewish tradition and history is connected to transition. The 40 days that Moshe spent in Har Sinai, actually 3 periods of 40 days. The 40 days in the wilderness, in the desert, the 40 days of rain at the time of the flood. Moshe's life is actually divided into 3 periods of 40 years. So the number 40 is always connected to transition. And here we have the idea that water becomes the agency, becomes the way, the method to go from a state of impurity to a state of purity. Now, I should have mentioned, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned it already, when we're talking about impurity, we're not talking about physical uncleanliness. That's never a connection that is made. That's why I use the word ritual impurity, because it's not having to do with physical cleanliness or uncleanliness. It's a spiritual concept. And so here we see that water becomes the way that we make the transition from impurity to purity. So now I'll just mention a few ideas of when we use the mikvah. So in our day, the most probably important and common use of the mikvah is in the laws of family purity, when a woman after menstruation and after she stops bleeding, she counts 7 days. They're called the 7 clean days. And then after the whole period is done, then she goes to the mikvah, and now husband and wife are together intimately again in marital union. So here it's a clear transition, not only from a state of impurity to purity, but from a state where husband and wife do not even touch physically, and of course do not have marital relations, to the coming back together. So that is probably the most important usage. We also see, and we'll get into this a little bit more, is that the Arizal, the Baal Shem Tov, made going to the mikvah by men a very, very important part of spiritual service, about coming to a place of a spiritual elevation. And especially Erev Shabbat, when we go from the transition from the 6 days of the week to Shabbat. That we'll talk more about soon. Then we have the major transition from someone who's going through conversion. And after however long that they've studied, they're now approved by the Jewish court. So men and women who are converting need to go to the mikvah. And here is, again, an obvious transition from being a non-Jew to being a Jew. And the way that it's done is through immersing in a mikvah. For a man also has to have circumcision, or if he's had circumcision, at least a drop of blood has to be drawn from the male organ. And the last thing is another transition, and that is with vessels. And so if we buy a new vessel made by a non-Jew, before using it, we take it to the mikvah, and it changes ownership from non-Jewish to Jewish. And so therefore, again, it has to go through a mikvah. So all of these are major transitions, either in daily life or in the big picture, like conversion. So now I want to mention that in the Torah itself, in the 5 books, the word mikvah is mentioned 3 times. 3 times. So I read one already. That's in the book of Leviticus, and that's where it is talking about what we call a mikvah today. But the question is, why do we call it a mikvah? And that we have already in the 10th verse of the Torah, on the 2nd day of creation. So this is when God separates between the upper waters and the lower waters. And in the 10th verse, it says, Vayikra Elokim liyabasha eretz ulemikveh hamayim kara yamim. Excuse me, this is on the third day. Excuse me, it's on the third day already. On the second day, God divided between the upper waters and the lower waters. But now the question is, well, what's happening with the lower waters? So here, the verse I just read says, and God called the dry land Eretz, and the gathering of waters he called the seas. This is the first and foundational mention of the idea of a gathering of water is called a mikvah. And so that's where we get the name that we commonly associate with the mikvah that we go to. But here it's used in a much broader sense. It means any gathering of water has the name mikvah. The next place that it's mentioned, interestingly enough, is during the plagues. And that is in the 7th chapter, the 19th verse. So it says like this. This is when God is telling Moshe that all of the waters of Egypt are going to turn into blood. And so he tells Moshe to talk to Aaron, that he should take his staff and he should hit the waters of Mitzrayim on their streams and on their rivers and on their lakes and on their gatherings of water. So here again, the word mikvah is coming during the plagues, but here all of the waters of Egypt, all of the streams, the rivers, and any gathering of water is going to turn into blood. And then the third time that it's mentioned is what we read in Vayikra, the one verse about mikvah that we read. Ach mayan ubor mikvah mayim yeh tahor. Only a spring and a pit, a gathering of water shall be clean. So that's it for the Chumash. But now, very interestingly, in the prophets, and all in the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah 3 different times mentions mikvah, but here, interestingly enough, it's in a different context. As we know, words have different meanings. And so here in the book of Jeremiah, the word, if you look at mikvah, mem kuf vav hey. The mem, by the way, this is true in many, many words in Hebrew. Mem means place, connected to a verb. So let's just say a hotel is called a malon. The mem means a place of, and lon comes from the word leina, a place for sleeping. So that's the mem of many, many words, means the place of. And so literally, the gatherings of water is the kuf, vav, and the hey. And the mem, it means the place of gathered waters. But the word kuf, vav, hey also has a different meaning altogether, which means hope. During the month of Elul, through Hoshana Rabbah, we read the 27th Psalm. And at the end, we say, Kaveh el Hashem Chazak v'yametz libecha b'kavi el Hashem. Hope in God and strengthen yourself, and God will strengthen you and have hope in God. So there, the root, kuf vav he, means to hope. So if you go to the book of Jeremiah in the 14th chapter, the 8th verse, so it says like this, mikvah Yisrael moshio be'et sarah. The hope of Israel will save in the time of trouble. So here, Jeremiah, it's the same word, mikvah, but he's using it as that we know that sometimes God is referred to hamakom, the place. Here it doesn't mean literally the place of hope, saying that God is the headquarters. He's the address. He's the facilitator of hope. And he will save in a time of trouble. So that's in Jeremiah 14:8. In the 17th chapter, the 13th verse, so again, Jeremiah uses the same phrase, mikvah Yisrael Hashem. The hope of Israel is Hashem. Call ozveka yoveshu. Anyone who abandons you will be embarrassed, because God is the hope of Israel. We should never abandon God or the hope in God. And then one last time, towards the end of the book of Jeremiah, in chapter 50, verse 17, let's see if I have the right one. I might have written down the wrong verse here because I don't see it here, but trust me that a third time in the book of Jeremiah, he uses the same term, mikvah Yisrael Hashem. The hope of God, the hope of Israel is God. So this is just a very, very important idea, because now we can connect the two meanings of mikvah. On one hand, it's a gathering of water. On the other hand, we're told it's a place of hope. So these go together very, very beautifully, because we go to the mikvah in all these different times of transition, from husband and wife being separated, and now through the waters of the mikvah coming back together. So it's so hopeful, optimistic, joyful. A non-Jew who's been preparing for maybe years to become Jewish, and then they go to the mikvah and they come out, they're Jewish. So the hope, the joy, the optimism, the fulfillment. And anytime someone would be in a state of ritual impurity, and now they go to the mikvah and they come out, they're now pure, especially at the time of the temple. Now they could go to the temple. So this is just a beautiful connection between the spiritual meaning of the mikvah and how it affects the person. more than just, okay, this is something I have to do to become ritually pure. The whole process is full of hope and depths and spiritual elevation. Now, one thing I didn't mention before, but I'll mention now, is a very interesting idea about how they came to the 40 measurements of water. As we said, it has to be enough to cover a whole person. And 40 sa was considered, like we'll call it, a comfortable average amount for any person to be able to somewhat easily immerse. But there's one opinion that if you had 20 sa, a person with maybe difficulty, maybe they'd have to be more like horizontal, but they could get under the water. This is not the halacha, but it's an idea that 20 would be enough. But there's a concept of what's called bitul, nullification. In Jewish law, there's different types of nullification. The most well-known one is called batul b'shishim, when you have two different types of food, for example. And the classic example is you have a big pot of cholent on the stove, and by accident, a drop of milk falls into the cholent. So the question is the whole cholent now treif? And if it's not, well, what's the percentage of milk that would make a treif? So the law is 1 in 60. In other words, if it's less than 1 part to 60 parts, it becomes nullified, batel, nullified. Now, there are other types of nullification, and one of them is in a majority, where one ingredient will become nullified if there's a majority that is okay. So this is just one idea that was brought that has a deep spiritual idea, is that if technically we only need like bottom line 20 sa, then 40 would mean that that's enough that the 20 is nullified in the 40. But this tells us really one of the main spiritual intentions of the mikvah. Any discussion of mikvah always comes back to the words rebirth and the idea of what's called returning to the womb, of nullifying our ego, nullifying a previous state of existence. So in a sense, when someone becomes Jewish, they're nullifying their previous life into the new life of being a Jew. It doesn't mean that everything they did in the past was horrible or terrible. That's not what it means. It just means that a person is taking on a whole new identity. And so their old identity has to become nullified into a new identity. And so symbolically, it's done through the water. Anytime we're in a state of ritual impurity, so the water of the mikvah nullifies the previous state of being impure. And now we come out of the mikvah and we're pure. But spiritually, we're told that this is one of the main intentions, is to reach a level of returning to the womb. So when we immerse totally in the water, it's very much like being in the embryonic fluid. We're like returning to the ayin. And when we said 1 in 60, this idea of nullifying how one becomes nullified in 60. So the word for becoming nothing, ayin, is aleph, which equals 1, and then the yud and nun equals 60. So going into a state of nothingness, of rebirth, of renewal, this is like the main experience of the mikvah. So we see this in a beautiful way. Again, we're going to take the word kaveh here. Kuf vav hey. This is the gathering of the waters with, of course, the mem. Means it's the place of the gathering of the waters. So if you look at the middle letter of kaveh, so you have kuf vav, which means kav, a line. Well, this word is very, very important in the mystical teachings of the Arizal, his cosmology, where when God wanted to create the world, so first he had to mitzamtzem, as it were, himself. He had to contract his infinite being to create a vacuum. And into the vacuum, he shone a ray of light, a kav of light. And from that kav of light comes all of existence. And so we're told that this kav of light is bringing the Or Ein Sof into finite reality. It becomes the animating force of finite reality, but it becomes somewhat hidden within finite reality. So here we see this is the basis of the mikvah. So this idea of the tzimtzum, so this is connected to the state of nullification. God, as it were, made a space of nullification, and in that space comes this ray of light. So it's the same thing when we go to the mikvah, when we can reach mentally, emotionally, spiritually, a state of being open to rebirth, being open to renewal. So then the kav of light enters into us, and that becomes the spark of renewal. So connected to this is a kavana from the Baal Shem Tov for the mikvah. And in short, it's based on a gematria. The gematria of mikvah is 151. Mem is 40, kuf is 100, vav is 6, and hey is 5. So 5 and 6 and 140 equals 151. So the Baal Shem Tov revealed as a kavana for the mikvah that if you take one of the names of God, which is Aleph and Hey and Yud and Hey, Ekia. This is the name that God revealed to Moshe at the burning bush. And it only appears there. When God says, who shall I tell them sent me? When I go back to Egypt, they're going to ask, well, who sent you? What do I tell them? So God said, tell them that Ekia Asher Ekia sent you. I will be that I will be. So the Baal Shem Tov says, this is one of the methods. For those who have the book 70 Faces, you'll see a whole chapter which is called Miluim. When you take a word and you look at each of the letters that makes the word and you spell out the letters you spell out the letters that make the letter, that make the word. So in other words, if we have Aleph and Hey and Yud and Hey, so Aleph, you spell it Aleph, Lamed, Pei. Hey can be spelled in a number of different ways, but in this particular way, it's Hey, Hey. Yud is spelled Yud, Vav, Daled, and another Hey, Hey, Hey. Now, if you add up Aleph, Lamed, Pei, Hey, Hey, Yud, Vav, Daled, Hey, Hey, it equals 151. It equals mikvah. But the important thing here is this name is I will be. So the Baal Shem Tov was teaching us that the experience of going to a mikvah is the experience of I will be. It's experience of rebirth, of renewal, of spiritual elevation. But paradoxically, it happens to first the stage of tzimtzum, of contraction and humbleness and nullification. And then we become open to becoming something new. I will be. It's a very, very beautiful kavanah. It's a kavanah I use every time I go to the mikvah. Among other, there are many, many different kavanot for the mikvah. But it definitely comes straight from the Baal Shem Tov. This idea of coming to be through the experience of the mikvah. Okay, so now I want to read from I'm going to do it in English, from the Mishnah of Yoma. It's the 8th chapter, the 9th Mishnah of Yoma. In the Gemara, it's page 85b, this following teaching. Now, this teaching is very, very important because it's quoted in Rabbi Akiva's name, and it became a famous song, and it's especially sung in Lag BaOmer, because along with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the hero, the star of Lag BaOmer is Rabbi Akiva, who was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's Rebbe. So here's what the Mishnah says. Rabbi Akiva said, "Happy are you, Israel. Before whom do you purify yourselves? Who purifies you? Your Father in heaven. It is thus written in Ezekiel, I will sprinkle pure water upon you, and you shall be clean. And it is written in Jeremiah 14:8. This is one of the verses that we read from Jeremiah. God is Israel's mikvah. Just as the mikvah purifies the unclean, so God purifies Israel." So this is from Rabbi Akiva, and he's taking the 3 different verses that we mentioned from Jeremiah, but he's connecting it. He's connecting it to not only cleanliness, purity, but this idea is like the hope that we have that our Father in heaven, he purifies us. He is the hope of Israel. So that's just a very, very beautiful Mishnah. Again, from the Mishnah Yoma in chapter 8, the 9th Mishnah. Okay, so we actually have finished what I wanted to give over here, but actually I'm going to give over one other idea. One other idea. This is a absolutely beautiful, stunning teaching from Rav Ginsburg about the laws of family purity. We know from the Baal Shem Tov that one of his major teachings was that every process goes through 3 stages. In Hebrew, hachna'ah, havdalah, and hamtaka. In English, submission, separation, and sweetening. And the Baal Shem Tov says every process, Rabbi Ginsburg has picked up on this in a major way. And in teachings over the last 50 years, he has explained numerous hundreds of different processes that follow this 3-staged process called submission, separation, and sweetening. In short, just a very, very practical example is if someone wants to accomplish something. So the first stage is making a decision and applying one's will, directing one's will to do the task at hand. It could be a task of 10 minutes. It could be a task of 10 weeks. It could be a task of 10 years, but it's going to follow the same process that the Baal Shem is explaining. But the first thing is a person has to submit their will, their time, their energy, and their sincerity, their dedication to doing what they decided to do. The second stage is called separation. So anytime we have a task, big or small, we have to go through a mental process of what is going to help me finish this task. What's going to take me away from it is going to distract me. Again, it could be a 10-minute task or a 10-year task, but it doesn't matter. In the process, it will be a constant. Is this going to bring me closer to my goal, or is this going to just, waste my time? And a person might have to make thousands of decisions along the way. That's called separation. And the final one is called sweetening. And this has 2 aspects. One is, okay, we've now accomplished what we wanted to accomplish. Then the question is, are we happy with it? Sometimes someone spends years on a project. And then when they get to the end, it's like, it's not what I thought it would be. And that could lead to tremendous frustration, upset, everything. So the greatest sweetening is if you want to accomplish something and you do that, you're happy with it. And the other part of the sweetening is when a person can give themselves a pat on the back and also acknowledge and be willing to praise God for helping me accomplish this. Praising God is such a sweet experience. It's so sweet when we can acknowledge God's help and assistance and really feel joyous that, wow, the creator of the universe helped me accomplish this. So having said that, Rav Ginsburg, and I'm only giving over the very basic 3 stages here. In a deeper way, Rav Ginsburg breaks it into 9 stages. In other words, each stage has all the other stages. In other words, there's submission of submission, there's separation of submission, and there's sweetening of submission. The same thing with separation and sweetening. But just in short, so Rav Ginsburg explains for the process of family purity. So husband and wife are together, and then she sees blood. She begins menstruating. So husband and wife have to separate, and they have to do it immediately. Now, what happens if, it's date night and they had plans of, being intimate at the end of the night, but right before she starts menstruating. So they have to separate. So this is just an example of, because we believe in Jewish law and we follow the laws of family purity, but we have to submit our will to the circumstances in the moment. In other words, now husband and wife have to separate for 12 days. So that is a true feeling of submission, of hachna'ah. Psychologically, emotionally, it's like, oi, oi. But we believe in the process. It's actually a tremendous process. And then what happens in the second stage is literally separation. That until the woman stops menstruating and then counts 7 clean days, there's literally separation. What happens at the end of the separation stage of this process? She goes to the mikvah, and they're together again, like chatan and kala. That is the greatest sweetening. Anyone who has lived the laws of family purity. So we do it because we see the whole picture, and nothing keeps a relationship more fresh than the laws of family purity. What happens in the world a real lot, is people come together because of sexual attraction, because it's the way of the world that people don't wait to get married to have relations, and they're connected. There's no doubt that sexual relations can really bring people together. But when it becomes really the only thing or the main thing, so they go ahead, they think they're in love, they get married, and after a few years, it's not exactly what they thought, but especially sexually, they get tired of each other. Simple as it is. The laws of family purity almost ensure keeping the relationship fresh. So that's why everyone talks about what's called mikvah night, because it's like wedding night, and it really feels like that. So I did it in short to see this process of the Baal Shem Tov as it runs through the laws of family purity. The submission, separation, and the sweetening. But like I said, Rav Ginsburg makes it even more precise as he goes through each of the stages. So tonight we did dedicate the whole learning to the idea of ritual purity, the role of water, the idea of transition, and how water is the agent, the agency of transition in so many different cases in Jewish tradition. And we saw the beautiful connection between the actual word of mikvah, meaning a gathering of water, but also a gathering of hope, and how that comes together. So I want to bless everyone, especially in these somewhat difficult times, that we look to Hashem mikvah Hashem, mikvah Yisrael Hashem. The hope of God is Israel. And despite our current challenges and difficulties, we will get through this with God's help. And Bezrat Hashem, we are going to see great, great things soon.